Hey everyone, welcome back to Neural Battlefields. I'm your host, and today we're diving deep into one of history's most legendary conflicts. A war so famous that its stories have echoed through 3,000 years. A war that supposedly started over the most beautiful woman in the world, involved gods battling alongside mortals, and ended with a giant wooden horse. But here's the question we need to ask. How much of what we think we know about the Trojan War is actually true? How much is myth? And perhaps most disturbingly, how much was deliberate propaganda designed to justify conquest and glorify violence? This is the story of the Trojan War, the brutal truth behind the myth, the lies, and the ancient propaganda that shaped Western civilization. Let's start with what most people think they know. Paris, a Trojan prince, falls in love with Helen, the wife of Menelaus, king of Sparta. He takes her to Troy, either through seduction or abduction, depending on which version you hear. This insult triggers the greatest military alliance ancient Greece had ever seen. 1,000 ships launch across the Aegean Sea. The siege lasts 10 years. Heroes like Achilles, Hector, Ajax, and Odysseus fight in brutal combat. Gods descend from Mount Olympus to take sides. Finally, the Greeks trick their way into Troy using a massive wooden horse, and the city burns. It's an epic tale of honor, love, betrayal, and revenge. But here's where things get interesting. Archaeological evidence suggests that Troy was a real place, and it was indeed destroyed by war, but the reality was far more complex and far more brutal than Homer's poetry suggests. The war we remember today is a carefully constructed narrative written centuries after the actual events, shaped by political agendas, cultural biases, and the very human need to turn bloody conquest into heroic legend. Let me take you back to the real Bronze Age world of the 13th century BCE, because understanding the historical context changes everything. Troy, known to its inhabitants as Wilusa, wasn't just some romantic city waiting to be conquered over a love affair. It was a wealthy, strategically positioned fortress city controlling the entrance to the Dardanelles Strait, the gateway between the Aegean Sea and the Black Sea. This wasn't just important. This was everything. Control Troy, and you controlled one of the most vital trade routes in the ancient world. Ships carrying grain, metals, timber, and luxury goods from the Black Sea region had to pass by Troy. The city could demand tolls, regulate trade, and grow, fantastically wealthy in the process. The Trojans weren't isolated either. Archaeological evidence and Hittite records, yes, actual written documents from the period, show that Troy was likely allied with or under the protection of the Hittite Empire, one of the great superpowers of the Bronze Age. The Greeks, or more accurately, the Mycenaean civilization, were an aggressive, expanding network of warrior kingdoms constantly looking for resources, trade advantages, and glory. So let's be clear about what probably happened. This wasn't about Helen. This was about economics, power, and territorial expansion dressed up in romantic poetry written 400 years later. Now the question you might be asking is, did the Trojan War actually happen? And the answer is complicated but fascinating. In the 1870s, a German businessman named Heinrich Schliemann, obsessed with Homer's Iliad, went digging in modern-day Turkey at a site called Hisarlik. He found Troy. Or rather, he found multiple cities, built one on top of another over thousands of years. Layer upon layer of civilizations, each destroyed and rebuilt. The layer known as Troy 7, dating to around 1180 BCE, shows clear evidence of violent destruction. Skeletons found in the streets, arrowheads embedded in walls, hasty burials, buildings burned to the ground. Something catastrophic happened here. A war, almost certainly. The romantic war described by Homer, absolutely not. Here's what the evidence actually suggests. Troy 7 was besieged, attacked, and destroyed during a period of widespread chaos known as the Late Bronze Age collapse. This was when multiple civilizations across the eastern Mediterranean suddenly fell apart. The Mycenaean palaces in Greece were abandoned or destroyed. The Hittite Empire collapsed. Egyptian records describe invasions by mysterious sea peoples. trade networks broke down. Literacy disappeared in Greece for 400 years during what we call the Greek Dark Ages. The attack on Troy was likely part of this broader pattern of raids, migrations, and societal breakdown. It wasn't 1,000 ships from a unified Greek alliance fighting for 10 years over a kidnapped queen. It was probably one of many raids by Mycenaean warriors during this chaotic period, a brutal assault on a wealthy city that controlled vital trade routes. But here's where the propaganda begins. See, oral traditions about this raid survived through the Greek Dark Ages, passed down through generations of storytellers. And when Homer, whoever he was, composed the Iliad around 750 BCE, he wasn't writing history. He was creating an epic poem that reflected the values, politics, and worldview of his own time, not the Bronze Age. Homer transformed a brutal raid for economic gain into a glorious war about honor, love, and the favor of the gods. Why? Because that's what his aristocratic audience wanted to hear. They wanted to believe their ancestors were noble heroes fighting for righteous causes, not pirates and raiders killing for plunder. The Iliad became a founding myth for Greek identity, a story that justified Greek cultural superiority and glorified the warrior aristocracy. Let's talk about the characters for a moment, because this is where the propaganda gets really sophisticated. Take Achilles. In Homer's version, he's the greatest warrior who ever lived, brave, powerful, chosen by the gods, but tragic because of his pride and his awareness of his own mortality. He's become the archetypal hero of Western literature. But strip away the poetry and look at his actual actions in the story. He's a temperamental killer who throws a murderous tantrum when his war prize, a captured woman named Briseis, is taken from him. He refuses to fight, letting his own comrades die, until his best friend Patroclus is killed. Then he goes on a rampage, slaughtering Trojans indiscriminately, killing the Trojan prince Hector, and desecrating his corpse by dragging it around the city walls. This is your hero, a warrior so consumed by rage and pride that he commits what the Greeks themselves considered shameful acts. But Homer frames it as tragedy, not as the actions of a brutal warlord. That's propaganda, taking the savage reality of Bronze Age warfare and transforming it into something noble and worthy of glory. Or consider Helen, the supposed cause of the entire war, in the myth. She's either a victim of abduction or a willing participant in adultery, depending on which version you read. But what's consistent is that she becomes a symbol, not a person. She's the face that launched 1,000 ships. Her agency disappears. She exists in the story to justify male violence. Think about how disturbing this is. An entire city destroyed, thousands of people killed, women and children enslaved, all supposedly because of one woman's beauty or choice. The narrative removes all accountability from the Greek warriors by blaming everything on Helen. It's a classic propaganda technique, creating a scapegoat to justify aggression. The Trojans themselves are portrayed in interesting ways that reveal Greek biases. On one hand, Hector, the Trojan prince and greatest defender of Troy, is depicted as noble, brave, and devoted to his family. Homer gives him some of the most human moments in the entire epic, particularly his farewell to his wife Andromache and his infant son. But notice what Homer is doing here. By making Hector sympathetic, he makes Achilles' victory over him even more glorious. And by making the Trojans generally noble and worthy opponents, Homer elevates the Greek victory. You don't get glory from defeating weak or evil enemies. You get glory from defeating worthy ones. But let's not forget how the story ends for Troy. After Hector's death, the Greeks can't breach the walls through direct assault, so Odysseus comes up with the famous trick, the Trojan Horse. They build a massive wooden horse, hide soldiers inside it, pretend to sail away, and leave the horse as a supposed offering to the gods. The Trojans, despite warnings from the priest Laocoon and the prophet Cassandra, drag the horse inside the city walls. That night the Greek soldiers emerge, open the gates, and the Greek army pours in. What follows is described as total destruction. Men are slaughtered, King Priam is killed at the altar. Women and children are enslaved. Hector's infant son Astyanax is thrown from the city walls to prevent any future revenge. Hector's wife Andromache becomes a slave. The city is burned to the ground. This isn't a heroic ending. This is genocide. This is the complete annihilation of a civilization. Yet Homer and later Greek writers present this as a glorious victory, justified revenge for the taking of Helen. Now let's address the gods, because their role in the story is crucial to understanding the propaganda. Throughout the Iliad and the broader Trojan War cycle, gods constantly intervene in human affairs. Athena helps the Greeks. Apollo and Aphrodite support the Trojans. Zeus tries to remain neutral but gets pulled into the conflict. These divine interventions serve a specific purpose. They remove moral responsibility from human actions. When Achilles kills Hector, it's because the gods willed it. When Paris takes Helen, it's because Aphrodite promised her to him. When the Greeks sack Troy, it's because the gods judged that Troy must fall. This is propaganda at its most sophisticated. By attributing outcomes to divine will, the Greeks could commit atrocities while maintaining that they were merely instruments of fate and divine justice. The gods provided cosmic justification for human brutality. But here's something most people don't know. The Trojan War stories we have are almost entirely from the Greek perspective. What would the Trojan version sound like? We'll never know because Troy lost, and history is written by the victors. The Trojans left no epic poems, no histories from their viewpoint. Their voices were silenced forever when their city burned. All we have are Greek stories about Troy, Greek justifications for the war, Greek heroes celebrated in poetry. This matters because it means everything we think we know about the Trojan War comes through a filter of Greek cultural bias and political agenda. The Trojans are portrayed as foreigners, as others, despite archaeological evidence suggesting they were culturally quite similar to the Mycenaean Greeks. They worshipped similar gods, had similar social structures, spoke related languages. But in Greek literature, they become representatives of Asia, of the East, of everything non-Greek. This creates a cultural dividing line that influenced Western thought for thousands of years. The idea of Europe versus Asia, West versus East, civilization versus barbarism. Let me share something even more disturbing. The Trojan War stories became templates for justifying conquest throughout Western history. Roman writers like Virgil wrote the Aeneid, claiming that Rome was founded by Trojan survivors, thus connecting Roman imperial destiny to these ancient myths. Medieval Europeans claimed Trojan ancestry to legitimize their kingdoms. Even modern Western powers have used Troy as a metaphor for righteous wars against Eastern enemies. The Trojan War became what scholars call a foundation myth, a story that shapes cultural identity and justifies political actions. It taught generations of warriors that glory comes from conquest, that honor justifies violence, that might makes right when dressed in the language of heroism and divine will. So what's the brutal truth? The real Trojan War, if we can call it that, was probably a raid or series of raids by Mycenaean warriors against a wealthy city during a period of regional collapse. It was motivated by economics, greed, and the desire for plunder, not by love or honor. The siege probably didn't last 10 years. There was no wooden horse. The gods didn't intervene. And the destruction of Troy was one atrocity among many during the late Bronze Age collapse. But the mythologized version became something more powerful than the historical reality. It became a story that justified war, celebrated martial values, created cultural identity, and shaped how Western civilization thinks about conflict, honor, and heroism. It's propaganda in the deepest sense, not crude lies, but sophisticated storytelling that transforms brutal reality into inspiring myth. The Trojan horse itself, whether it existed or not, has become a metaphor for deception in warfare. The phrase, "beware of Greeks bearing gifts," comes from this story. In modern language, a Trojan horse means something that appears beneficial but contains a hidden threat. Even 3,000 years later, this story shapes how we think and speak. Here's what makes this particularly relevant today. We still do this. We still wrap wars in noble language, still create heroes and villains, still use propaganda to transform political violence into righteous crusades. We still tell ourselves that our side fights for freedom, honor, and justice, while the other side represents everything evil. The techniques might be more sophisticated now, using modern media instead of epic poetry, but the fundamental pattern remains the same. The Trojan War teaches us to question the stories we're told about conflict, to look beyond the heroic narratives and examine the economic, political, and strategic realities underneath, to remember that war propaganda has always existed and has always served the interests of those in power, to recognize that the voices of the defeated are silenced, and history comes to us filtered through the perspectives of victors. It also teaches us about the power of storytelling itself. Homer's Iliad is one of the greatest works of literature ever created. Its influence on Western culture is immeasurable, but great art can still contain propaganda. Beautiful poetry can still justify atrocities. We can appreciate the literary achievement while recognizing the political agenda it serves. So the next time you hear about the Trojan War, remember this. You're not hearing about history. You're hearing the echoes of ancient Greek propaganda, so effective that it shaped civilization for 3 millennia. The real war was brutal, brief, and motivated by power and plunder. The mythological war is eternal, inspiring, and deliberately constructed to glorify violence and justify conquest. That's the truth behind the Trojan War, the brutal reality hidden beneath layers of myth, lies, and ancient propaganda. A story about how humans transform atrocity into glory, how victors control the narrative, and how powerful storytelling can be in shaping not just how we remember the past, but how we understand war, honor, and heroism itself. The ruins of Troy still stand in Turkey today, silent witness to both the historical destruction and the mythological fame that followed. The real people who lived and died there deserve to be remembered as human beings, not just characters in someone else's propaganda. Their city burned not because of divine will or romantic love, but because of human greed, violence, and the eternal struggle for power that drives so much of history. And maybe that's the most important lesson of all. When we strip away the myths and the propaganda, we find something more valuable than heroic fantasy. We find truth, uncomfortable and brutal, but real. We find human beings making human choices with human consequences. We find a warning about how easily we transform violence into virtue when it serves our purposes. If you found this exploration of the Trojan War valuable, consider subscribing to Neural Battlefields. Hit that like button if this changed how you think about ancient mythology and history. Share this with anyone who loves history, mythology, or understanding how propaganda shapes our world. Drop a comment below telling me what other historical myths you'd like me to investigate. Do you think the Trojan War really happened? Do you believe Homer was recording history or creating propaganda? Let's discuss. This is Neural Battlefields, where we don't just retell history, we decode it. Until next time, question everything, seek the truth behind the myths, and remember that the stories we tell about war reveal more about us than about the past. Stay curious, stay critical, and I'll see you in the next one.